One of the claims that I frequently hear is that the Gospels were anonymous, that we don't actually know who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The problem with this claim is that there is no evidence for it. And there is much evidence that we always knew who the Gospels authors were, and that those authors were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, where did people get this idea that the Gospels are anonymous? Well, within the Gospels themselves, we don't have the authors saying things like, "Hi, I'm Matthew. I'm an eyewitness to all of these things." The Gospels were written in third person. So for some people, this is evidence that these were written anonymously. One of the popularizers of this idea that the Gospels were anonymous is Bart Ehrman. And I'm just going to read just a quote from his book, Jesus Interrupted. He says, "All the Gospels were written anonymously, and none of the writers claims to be an eyewitness. Names are attached to the titles of the Gospels, but these titles are later additions to the Gospels, provided by editors and scribes to inform readers." Now, where is the evidence that these titles are later additions to the Gospels? There is no evidence. And in fact, the evidence is quite in the opposite direction. So in a minute, I'm going to pull up some images of some of the oldest manuscripts that we have and show you that they had the attributions from the very beginning, or from the oldest ones that we have. Now, some people will say, yeah, but the oldest ones we have are from at least 100 years after they were written. And how do you know that in that 100 years that those titles weren't added sometime within the 100 years? Well, there's some strong evidence that they were there from the beginning. Remember that these were documents that were being copied and distributed to various regions, and these regions didn't have very good communication with each other. So if titles were being added later, then we would expect that some of the titles would be different. Like if Matthew didn't write the Gospel of Matthew, then and that attribution was added later, then you would expect that in some places the manuscripts that are found would not say the Gospel according to Matthew, but it would be attributed to someone else. There is not a single manuscript that has been found to have differing titles attributed to different people. So as widespread as these manuscripts were distributed, right, they were all in absolute lockstep with who the authors of these Gospels were. So let me show you some of the manuscripts. So this is a 2nd century papyrus, P66. And at the top, it's very hard to see, but it says the Gospel according to John. John is a little bit cut off there at the top, but you can see that from the beginning, from this very ancient manuscript, there was the attribution to John. And here is P75. Now, in the middle, about the middle of this manuscript, you can see there it says the Gospel according to Luke, and that's the end of Luke. And then it starts with the Gospel according to John. So you have Luke and John mentioned here. This is a Codex Sinaiticus, 4th century. At the top, it says according to Mark. Now, that is one difference. There are differences in the way that these titles are written. So sometimes it says the Gospel according to Mark, and sometimes it just says according to Mark. So there is that a difference between some of the manuscripts, but we never have an example of the Gospel of Mark being attributed to a different author. Here's the Sinaiticus with according to Luke. Sinaiticus again, according to John. Here is the Codex Alexandrinus from the 5th century. And across the top, it's the Gospel according to Mark. The Gospel is like abbreviated there, but it says the Gospel according to Mark. And here is Alexandrinus, the Gospel according to Luke. This is from the Codex Bezae from the 5th century. And it says the Gospel according to Mark. And here we have the Gospel according to Luke from the same manuscript. Here we have the Codex Vaticanus, 4th century, according to Mark. So you can see that from all of our preserved manuscripts, and there's many more, by the way, I'm just showing a few of them, but the attributions to the authors are there from the very beginning. Now, of course, there was a period of time where we don't have manuscripts that are older than the 2nd century. But, again, these manuscripts were so widespread that it would be very difficult for communication to happen, 100 years after the fact, for all of the manuscripts to attribute the Gospels to the same people if the authors were unknown at the beginning. It's also important to say that there were many Christian writings that were out there that were not embraced by the church. And it's because the authors were unknown or the authors were misattributed. Well, those are not the books that eventually made it into the canon because the church rejected them from the beginning. So if the church had not known who the authors of these writings were, it is highly unlikely that they would have been accepted from the beginning. So the Gospels were not anonymous. They were written in 3rd person, and it is true that they never come out and directly say, hey, I'm the one who wrote this. Although the Gospel of John gets close to doing that. The way that John writes, he refers to himself as the beloved disciple. And there's many indications within the Gospel of John that he is the writer of the Gospel. But, whether or not the Gospel writers directly say, I am an eyewitness, and, it's completely irrelevant to whether or not these Gospel authors were known and whether the authors were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There is substantial evidence, and you've seen some of it, that the Gospel authors were known from the beginning, that these manuscripts were received by the churches with known authorship and with the titles already there in the manuscripts themselves. So I hope this was helpful, and thanks for watching. His own self for heavenly food.